The first thing I remember is the sound of sleet against the meetinghouse windows. Not hard rain, just those little grains of ice tapping the glass one after another as if somebody outside had a handful of dry corn and was throwing it against the panes. Her coffin was at the front of the room, plain pine, no flowers, no photograph. And for nearly 2 hours men stood up and spoke about death, obedience, mercy, and the shortness of this life. But they did not say her name. I sat 3 benches from the back with my hat between my hands, and before that service ended, I understood something I had spent years refusing to see. We had not only lost her, we had helped make her disappear. My name is Mahlan. I have been Amish all my life, and I am an old man now. I have worked the same ground through good seasons and poor ones, raised children, held grandchildren, buried people I loved, and watched more changes come to our community than I ever expected to see. I tell these stories because time has a way of showing you the part you missed when you were younger. If you have ever watched a family push somebody away and wondered whether silence can do as much harm as angry words, I would like to hear what you think after you listen to this one. Her name was Esther. I will say it now because we should have said it then. Esther was my cousin. She was 6 years younger than I was, and when we were children, that was enough of a difference that I thought of her as one of the little ones. I remember her running barefoot along the packed dirt beside her father's barn, carrying a blue enamel cup with both hands because it was too full of water. Half of it would be gone by the time she reached whoever had asked for it. She laughed easily in those days. Not loudly. Esther never did anything loudly. But her face would change before the sound came, and you knew she was about to laugh because her eyes narrowed and her chin tucked down. Her father, Uncle Levi, was a quiet man even by the standards of our district. He believed in order. He believed a person should know where he belonged and should be grateful for it. I do not say that as an insult. I believed much the same thing for most of my life. When you are raised inside a close community, order does not feel like a fence. It feels like shelter. The same families sit near you on Sundays. The same hands come when a barn burns. The same women bring food when a baby is born. The same men stand in the cold when a grave has to be dug. You learn early that belonging is not an idea. It is bread on your table when your own flour barrel is empty. But belonging can become something else when everybody is afraid of what happens if one person steps beyond the line. Esther married at 23. Her husband was a man named Daniel from a district about 12 miles from ours. I knew him only a little then. He was steady, broad-shouldered, good with horses, and the kind of man older men approved of because he did not waste words. For the first years, I heard nothing unusual about their marriage. They had 2 daughters, then a son. They bought a small place with poor soil and made it work. Esther quilted. Daniel did cabinet work in winter. If you had asked me then how she was doing, I would have said she was doing what all of us were doing, living the life she had been given. That answer troubles me now. The first sign that anything had changed came one October afternoon when I saw her standing outside the harness shop in town. I had gone in for a buckle and a length of leather. She was across the road beside a hitching rail, alone. The maple leaves were red along the gutter, wet from rain, and she was holding an envelope. I remember that envelope because it looked too white against her dark sleeve. She saw me. I raised my hand. She raised hers. Then she folded the envelope in half and put it into her apron pocket. I did not ask what it was. Years later, I learned it was a letter from her older daughter, Miriam, who had left the church the previous spring. Miriam had not vanished. She had not gone far. She was living in a town less than an hour away and working in a bakery. But in our district, Her leaving became a wound everybody kept touching to see if it still hurt. People spoke carefully around Esther. Some spoke too carefully. Others stopped speaking to her about Miriam at all. There is a kind of silence that pretends to be kindness. You tell yourself you do not want to upset somebody, so you do not mention the child they miss. You tell yourself the rules are clear, so you do not ask whether the rules have become heavier than the person carrying them. You tell yourself there is nothing useful you can say. After a while, silence becomes the only thing you have said. Esther continued to write to Miriam. At first, only a few people knew. Then somebody saw a letter. Somebody else heard that Esther had met her daughter in town. The matter came before the ministers. I was not in that meeting, and I will not pretend I know every word spoken there. What I know is what Esther told my wife later, and what the men told the district afterward. Esther had been warned that continuing close contact with Miriam would be seen as refusing the discipline the church had placed around her daughter. I remember hearing this and thinking the warning was reasonable. That is the part I wish I could change, not because I understood everything. I did not. Not because I wanted Esther to suffer. I did not. I simply believed that rules held us together, and once you begin making exceptions for pain, I thought every rule becomes optional. I was 46 years old enough to know better, perhaps, young enough to think certainty was the same thing as wisdom. For a time, Esther obeyed outwardly. She stopped meeting Miriam where people could see them. She stopped asking neighbors to carry letters, but mothers do not stop being mothers because a committee has reached a decision. Esther found other ways. That sentence sounds almost rebellious when I say it now. It was not. She was not trying to overthrow anything. She wanted to know whether her daughter had enough money for rent. She wanted to know whether she was eating. She wanted to hear if she was sick. She wanted to know the name of the man Miriam was thinking of marrying. Small things, ordinary things, the things a mother asks because a mother does not know how not to ask them. One winter, Esther became ill. Nothing sudden, a cough that stayed too long, then weakness, then days when she could not finish her chores without sitting down. Daniel took her to a doctor, and after that, the seriousness of it became difficult to deny. I remember seeing him at an auction that spring. He stood beside a wagon wheel while men were bidding on tools. Everybody else watched the auctioneer. Daniel stared at the mud. We did what communities do when sickness comes. Meals appeared. Chores were covered. Women helped with washing. Men repaired a section of fence Daniel had not had time to touch. Nobody had to organize much. That part of our life is still beautiful to me. But Miriam was another matter. She wanted to come home. Esther wanted her there. And suddenly the old wound was open again. Some said sickness changed nothing. Some said a daughter should be permitted to see her mother. Some said permitting it would send the wrong message to younger people. I listened to those conversations in barns, near wagons, after church, and outside the feed store. Men spoke about principle while Esther lay in a back room growing thinner. I spoke about principle too. That is something I have had to live with. There is no use making myself kinder in the retelling than I was in the moment. I did not shout. I did not threaten anyone. I did something easier. I nodded. I agreed with men who sounded sure of themselves. I said we could not let emotion decide everything. I can still hear myself saying it. We could not let emotion decide everything, as if love for a dying mother were merely emotion, as if keeping order were not also driven by fear. Miriam came anyway. She arrived near dusk in a hired car and walked the last stretch from the road because she did not want the driver pulling into the lane. I did not see her arrive. My wife did. She had brought broth to Esther that evening. When she came home, she took off her bonnet and hung it on the peg by the door. She stood with her back to me for a long moment. Then she turned and said, "You know her name, Malin." That was all. I knew what she meant. I also knew she was not speaking only about Miriam. By then, Esther had become an issue to us, a question, a test of boundaries, a warning about what happens when family affection comes into conflict with church discipline. We had discussed her so many times that we had almost stopped seeing the woman herself, Esther, the girl with the blue enamel cup, the young mother who could piece a quilt so cleanly that the corners met like they had been measured with a ruler. The woman who sent food to my house when my youngest boy broke his leg and my wife was exhausted from tending him. The cousin who knew every verse of an old hymn but always came in half a beat late because she listened before she sang. We knew all of that. And still, somehow, we had made her smaller than a rule. Miriam stayed with her mother for 2 nights. After that, she left again. I will not dress those 2 days up into a grand reconciliation. Life does not always give you scenes like that. Esther was weak, Miriam was tired, Daniel was caught between wanting peace in his house and fearing what the district would say. There were long hours when nobody knew what to do with their hands. But she was there, that mattered. Esther died 3 weeks later. The morning of the funeral was bitter enough that the horse's breath hung white above the hitching rail. There had been sleet in the night. The yard was hard underfoot with a thin glaze that cracked when boots stepped on it. Inside, wet wool and lamp oil mixed with the smell of coffee coming from the back room. Miriam came. She stood near the rear wall with her husband. By then she had married. I had never met him. He wore a dark coat that was plainly cut, but not Amish, and he kept both hands folded in front of him as if he understood that every movement would be noticed. People noticed. Of course they did. Nobody asked them to leave. That is important. But very few people greeted them either. That is also important. There are things a community can do without deciding together to do them. Nobody announces, "We will make this person feel alone." Nobody needs to. One person looks away. Another finds somebody else to speak with. A third decides this is not the proper moment. A fourth says nothing because he is waiting to see what the others do. Soon the whole room has made a choice no single person believes he made. The service began. A minister spoke about the brevity of life. Another spoke about submission to God. A hymn was sung. The benches creaked as people shifted. The sleet tapped at the windows. And Esther's name was not spoken, not once. At first I thought I had missed it. Then I began listening for it. I looked at the coffin. I looked at Daniel. I looked toward the back where Miriam stood with her face pale and still. The strangest thing about a name is how little space it takes. Esther, 2 syllables, less than a second, and we could not give her even that. I do not know whether the ministers had agreed beforehand not to say it. I do not know if each man simply followed the tone set by the one before him. I will not accuse people of a decision I cannot prove they made. What I know is what happened in that room. We buried a woman while speaking around her. After the service, the men carried the coffin outside. The sleet had stopped. The sky was the color of old tin. I walked behind the others toward the cemetery, and my boots kept slipping a little on the frozen path. At the grave, dirt had been piled under a canvas. The edges of the canvas were stiff with ice. Somebody lifted it back. The earth underneath was dark and almost black against the snow. I remember looking at that dirt and thinking of the letters Esther had hidden in her apron pocket. I thought of all the times I had heard her situation discussed without asking her how she was bearing it. I thought of how certain I had felt. Certainty is a warm coat when you are young. You pull it tight around yourself and believe the cold cannot reach you. Age teaches you where the holes were. After the burial, Miriam stood alone for a while. People were already turning back toward the house where food had been laid out. I wanted to go to her. I did not. That may be the hardest part of this story for me to admit. I wanted to. I remember taking one step in her direction. Then I stopped. I was thinking about who might see. I was thinking about whether speaking to her would be misunderstood. I was thinking about a dozen things that seemed important for perhaps 10 seconds. Then Daniel went to her. He put one hand on her shoulder. They stood there together beside the fresh grave. I walked back to the house. For years afterward, that one step stayed with me. Not the step I took, the one I did not. People like to imagine that regret comes from great decisions. Sometimes it does. But an old man can tell you that regret also lives in very small spaces. A chair you did not pull out, a letter you did not answer, a door you did not open, a name you did not say, one more step across a frozen yard. I saw Miriam only twice after that funeral. The last time was many years later at a farm stand beside a highway. I recognized her before she recognized me. Her hair had gray in it. That startled me because part of my mind had kept her young, standing at the back of that meeting house. We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. I asked about her family. She had children. One of them was already grown. She asked about mine. We spoke about ordinary things, the way people do when too much history is standing between them. I wanted to apologize. I had prepared apologies in my head before. Old men do that. We rehearse the words we should have said when the moment was still alive. But standing there, I understood that an apology could not be about making me feel cleaner. So I told her I remembered her mother. I said her name, Esther. Miriam looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. That was enough for that day. I have thought many times about what our community did wrong and what we did right. I am not interested in telling you that everything about discipline, tradition, or shared rules is cruel. That would be too easy, and it would not be true to the life I have lived. I have seen rules protect families. I have seen community expectations keep people from making selfish choices they later would have regretted. I have also seen forgiveness offered where the outside world might have expected rejection. But I have learned there is danger whenever a rule becomes more real to us than the person standing in front of us. A rule does not have eyes. A rule does not lose a daughter. A rule does not lie awake coughing in a back room, wondering whether there will be enough time to see her child again. People do. That does not mean every boundary is wrong. It means we should become very careful when obeying a boundary requires us to stop seeing a human being clearly. I wish I had understood that at 46. I understand it now. When I think of Esther today, I do not first remember the arguments around her. I remember a blue enamel cup sloshing water down the front of a little girl's dress. I remember wet red leaves outside the harness shop. I remember a white envelope disappearing into an apron pocket. I remember sleet against glass in a room full of people speaking about eternity while avoiding 2 simple syllables. And I remember that frozen yard, 1 step taken, 1 step withheld. 70 years teaches you many things, but one of the hardest is this. Silence is not always neutral. Sometimes silence is a decision we make together because no one person is brave enough to break it. If I could go back to that funeral, I would not stand up and make a speech. I would not argue with the ministers. I would not try to turn a burial into a protest. I would do something much smaller. I would walk to Miriam. I would take her hand. And I would say, "Your mother Esther was good to my family. I will remember her. That is all." Sometimes all a person needs is to know that somebody will still say the name. If stories like this mean something to you, you are welcome to subscribe and sit with me again. I have lived long enough to know that the memories we least want to revisit are often the ones with something left to teach us. And I would like to ask you one thing before you go. Have you ever seen a family or a community become so focused on what was proper that it forgot the person at the center of it? If you have, you can tell me about it in the comments. I read more of those words than you might think.